Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today is April 1st, 2025, and we are going to take a look at just one single day in global news.
Hmm.
We've got a lot of sources to pull from today, as always.
Yeah.
We've got the BBC, ABC News, the Guardian Al Jazeera, the Sun Sky News, the Independent, and NPR.
Wow. That's a lot.
It is quite a lot, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what we're trying to do today is we're trying to sort of see if, by looking at all these sources from just one day, if we can kind of understand maybe what's happening a little bit more broadly, in the world.
Yeah, I think that when you look at a day like this and you take a snapshot and it's coming from all these different places and different perspectives, I think that you do start to see kind of the themes, for lack of a better word, and I guess the pressures that are kind of happening in the world.
Right, and maybe even some of the connections between things that we might not normally think are connected.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, cool. So why don't we start with the UK?
Yeah.
It seems like April is not off to a good start financially for a lot of people in the UK.
Mm.
Yeah. We're seeing that council taxes and energy bills are both going up.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, and the BBC actually has kind of a detailed breakdown of which bills are increasing this week.
Okay.
It looks like single-parent households are going to be hit particularly hard by these increases.
Yeah, that makes sense, unfortunately.
Yeah. So I guess the question is what are the main factors that typically cause energy bills to increase like this?
Well, usually I think the biggest thing is that energy markets are global, right? So it could be something that happens geopolitically that makes energy prices go up, or even, just the typical supply and demand problems can cause costs to go up for the everyday person.
Yeah.
And, when we look at council tax increases, that usually has to do with funding challenges that local governments are facing, or what it actually costs to deliver services in those areas, and also what national policies are impacting local budgets. So the fact that this is hitting single parents harder than most, I think, just kind of highlights the fact that there are these vulnerabilities in the economy and in the social safety net that we have.
Right, and those things, kind of predate all of these increases.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the government, of course, is saying that there's also been a rise in minimum wage and state pensions.
Okay.
And obviously that's a good thing. But I guess the question is how effective are those increases going to be when everything else is costing more?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, of course, it's great that minimum wage is going up and that pensions are going up.
Sure.
But the big question is it really enough to keep up with how much it costs to just buy the things that you need to live?
Right. Just the essentials.
Exactly. And inflation plays a huge role in this, right?
Yeah.
So, how much are prices increasing? And if those prices are increasing faster
Right.
than these increases to minimum wage and pensions, then it's not really doing much good, is it?
Right. And we are seeing some signs of that rising inflation. Sky News is reporting that food inflation is edging up, and it's expected to accelerate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And on a similar note, Sky News is also reporting that the price of flights might increase because of a change to the tax.
It's always something.
Yeah, it does seem like it. And the general mood from the public is not really that great.
Right.
People are expressing disbelief at all of these price hikes that are happening. And Sky News even used the term awful April.
Awful April. I like that.
I know. Yeah, pretty catchy, huh?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And even the BBC license fee has increased. And some people are referring to that as a bad joke.
Yeah, can't really blame him for that one.
I know, right?
It does seem like it's all kind of happening at once.
It does, yeah.
When flight costs go up, maybe that's not as essential as, paying to heat your home.
Right.
But it does affect people, if they can't travel to see family.
Right.
Or if they need to travel for work, and, food inflation affects everyone. When all of these costs go up at the same time, it just takes away from the money that people have to spend on other things, or even just to save.
Absolutely, and it could really impact quality of life, can't it?
Yeah, definitely.
It's interesting, though, because kind of in the midst of all of this domestic financial news, Sky News also mentioned that the value of the pound has dipped a little bit.
Okay.
And they said that this is happening because U.S. markets are sort of anticipating what they're calling Liberation Day.
Liberation Day, what is that?
I know it sounds kind of wild, right?
Yeah.
What do you think is behind all of this?
I would guess that Liberation Day stuff has to do with some kind of announcement about U.S. trade policy
Yeah.
and maybe tariffs, you know?
Right.
Financial markets always try to predict what's going to happen in the future.
Sure.
And when it seems like something big is about to change in trade, especially when it involves the U.S., that makes them nervous. They don't like uncertainty. And so when that happens, they try to adjust their investments. And that's probably what's causing that little dip in the value of the pound.
Right, so they're basically trying to prepare for the possible economic impact of these tariffs.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so speaking of which, that kind of brings us to the next big story, which is Trump's tariffs and how that's impacting global trade.
Okay.
According to the BBC, a UK minister has said that the UK has a good chance of getting a deal that would overturn those tariffs.
Interesting.
But The Guardian's saying something very different. They're saying that Trump's trade war could cost the world $1.4 trillion.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And they're also saying that UK factories are already being negatively impacted by it.
That's not good.
No, it's not. So I guess the question is, how do economists even come up with a number like $1.4 trillion? Like, how do they even measure that?
Well, they use economic models to try to estimate the impact that tariffs could have. And those models take into account how much trade would be affected, how much demand will change when prices change, and then they even try to factor in what other countries might do, in response, like if they impose retaliatory tariffs as their own.
Wow.
Yeah, so that $1.4 trillion, that's probably their prediction for how much global GDP and trade flows could be negatively impacted over a period of time if these tariffs actually happen and they stay in place.
Right.
It's really complex.
Yeah.
But it gives you an idea of how bad it could be.
Wow. Okay, so Starmer, who's with the Labour Party, is saying that he thinks a future UK-US trade deal could actually lessen the negative effects of these tariffs.
Okay.
Which I guess makes sense in theory.
Yeah, it does.
But The Guardian is also reporting that the UK business secretary has denied that free speech issues were ever part of the US tariff talks.
Wait a minute. What does free speech have to do with any of this?
I know, it's a weird detail, right?
Yeah, it is.
It almost seems like maybe the US is trying to tie these trade negotiations to other things.
Yeah, that's not unheard of in international relations.
Right.
Oh,
It happens.
And so maybe the denial is just, them trying to downplay that, or maybe trying to reassure people in the UK that the talks are just about economics.
Possibly.
But I think this just kind of shows us that trade deals aren't always as simple as they seem.
Right. It's about way more than just tariffs and quotas.
Yeah.
There's always a lot of political stuff going on behind the scenes and social considerations, too.
Definitely. Okay, so The Guardian is also reporting on some special elections that are happening in the U.S.,
Okay.
and a lot of people are seeing these as kind of an early test of how popular Trump still is.
Mm-hmm.
The elections are taking place in Wisconsin and Florida.
Got it.
And The Independent is saying that even Trump's own advisors were apparently caught off guard by these Liberation Day tariff plans.
Oh, really? So they didn't see it coming?
Yeah, apparently not.
Hmm.
I mean, it doesn't really sound like a very carefully thought out plan, does it?
No, not really.
Yeah.
It makes it seem like maybe he's just making decisions on the fly. Right. And that can be really unsettling for businesses.
Definitely.
And also for other countries.
Yeah, they need to be able to plan, and they need to be able to count on things being relatively stable.
Right. And when your own team is surprised by your decisions, it just makes you seem unpredictable.
Exactly. And markets do not like that.
Right.
So we'll have to see how these special elections go and if voters approve of this way of doing things.
Yeah, exactly. The Independent also mentioned that despite the initial fears about the tariffs, the Dow actually rebounded.
Interesting.
Yeah, but they also said that financial markets don't believe in Trump's stable genius anymore.
Ooh, that's gotta sting.
I know, right?
But, maybe that rebound means that the market adjusted after that initial shock.
Right,
And now they've kind of settled on how serious they think this all is.
right.
But it does sound like there are some deeper doubts about his policies.
Right, they're not sure they're good for the long term.
Exactly.
Yeah. ABC News is reporting that Canada is getting ready for these tariffs to take effect.
Okay, yeah, well, they share such a long border with the U.S.
They do. Yeah.
And their economies are so closely tied together, so they could lose a lot if these tariffs actually happen.
Absolutely. And Al Jazeera is saying something very similar. They're saying that economies and markets around the world are really tense right now because of this upcoming deadline for the tariffs.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And Trump has said that he plans to impose these, what he calls reciprocal tariffs, on April 2nd.
Okay.
And he's saying that they're going to be lower than what other countries are charging the U.S. But we'll see.
Right. Well, I mean, that's kind of a common way to try to make tariffs sound better.
Right.
He's trying to make it sound like he's just responding to what other countries are already doing.
Right. It's not his fault.
Exactly. But what matters is what the actual levels are and which industries he decides to target.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And actually, NPR went to this place called Yiwu Trade City in China.
I've heard of that place.
Yeah, it's like this huge hub for global trade.
Yeah.
And they talked to some Chinese manufacturers there about how these U.S. tariffs are impacting them.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's really valuable to get that perspective because they're the ones who are actually on the ground dealing with this.
Totally, because this could affect supply chains all over the world, and it could mean that consumers end up paying more for things.
Right.
So their perspective is important.
Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, we wanted to talk about the earthquake that happened in Myanmar.
Oh, yeah. That's just awful.
It is, yeah. The BBC is reporting that the country actually held a minute of silence for the victims of the earthquake.
Mm.
And they're also saying that hopes of finding any more survivors are fading.
Yeah, that's understandable, I guess.
Yeah. Al Jazeera has put the death toll at over 2,700 now.
Wow.
Which is a big jump from what we saw earlier from NPR.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, it just goes to show how difficult it is to get accurate information in the immediate aftermath of a disaster like this. Everything is just so chaotic.
Yeah, there's so much damage to deal with, and it's hard to communicate. And then you're just trying to figure out how bad things really are.
Right.
Yeah, so that increasing death toll just shows how serious this earthquake was and how many people have been affected.
Absolutely. But then, amidst all this tragedy, there are these incredible stories of survival.
Oh, yeah.
Al Jazeera reported that they pulled this elderly woman from the rubble 91 hours after the earthquake.
Wow, that's incredible.
I know, it's amazing, right?
Yeah, it is.
But on a more somber note, The Guardian has this really disturbing report that's accusing the Myanmar junta of actually blocking aid from getting to the victims.
Oh, no, that's terrible.
Yeah, and at the same time, they're continuing to carry out airstrikes in the region.
That's just horrific.
It really is. I mean, what are some of the typical challenges that people face when they're trying to deliver aid after a disaster like this?
Well, even under normal circumstances, it can be difficult, because roads are damaged. Maybe the airport's closed and there just aren't enough resources to go around.
Sure.
But when you add political instability to the mix or an active conflict like in Myanmar, it just makes everything so much harder.
Right.
And if the junta is actually blocking aid, well, they might be trying to control the information that gets out, or they might be trying to exert their power over the people who are affected.
Right.
Or it's even possible that they're deliberately trying to prevent aid from reaching certain groups.
Right.
So it's just a terrible situation, and it really makes what was a natural disaster into a man-made humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And the needs in Myanmar are clearly huge.
Yeah.
NPR is talking about how urgently they need mobile medical units, and clean water and rescue efforts are getting more and more desperate as time goes on.
Yeah.
Medical supplies are also desperately needed as aid is slowly starting to come in, and NPR has some really powerful photos that show just how bad the destruction is.
It's hard to even imagine.
Yeah. ABC News is actually calling this a crisis on top of a crisis. And tragically, they're reporting that more than 700 people died when mosques collapsed during the earthquake.
Oh, gosh, it's just awful.
Yeah, it's terrible. And ABC News has also confirmed that the death toll has now risen to over 1,700.
Wow.
And an official from the IRC, the International Rescue Committee, told ABC News that the challenges are immense.
Yeah.
So it's a really bleak picture.
It is. So many people dying in places of worship just really shows you how widespread and random this earthquake was. It didn't discriminate.
Yeah. And when they say crisis on top of a crisis, they're probably referring to the fact that Myanmar was already really politically unstable.
Right. There was already a potential for conflict there, and now this disaster has just made everything so much worse.
All right. It just compounds all the problems.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's move on into some of the international political news that's happening. There's been a lot going on. The BBC is reporting that Marine Le Pen's allies are saying that a recent court verdict against her is a threat to democracy. And ABC News, The Guardian, and NPR have all confirmed that the French far-right leader has been found guilty at trial.
Okay, so what was this trial about? What happened?
It sounds like it probably had to do with some things that Le Pen has done or said in the past.
Okay.
Maybe hate speech or maybe some financial irregularities.
Got it.
But depending on how serious this verdict is and what kind of penalties she faces, it could definitely affect her chances of holding office in the future.
Right.
And it could also hurt her reputation.
Sure.
But, on the other hand, it could make her supporters even more devoted.
Yeah, they might see this as a political attack against her.
Right.
Yeah, so it could really go either way.
Right. And it could also have a big impact on the right-wing movement in Europe as a whole.
Definitely.
She's a very prominent figure, and now she's been at least temporarily removed from the political scene.
Yeah, that could create a power vacuum, or it could change the balance of power within those parties.
Absolutely. And The Guardian is quoting Le Pen's party president as saying that this ban is political and partisan.
Okay.
And The Independent is reporting that Le Pen herself is saying that she's going to fight this ban.
She's not going down without a fight.
Yeah, it sounds like in other political news, ABC News and Al Jazeera are both reporting that South Korea's constitutional court is going to make a decision on Friday about whether or not to impeach President Yoon.
Okay, another big political event.
Yeah, it is.
Hmm.
So we've got these two situations, one in France and one in South Korea,
Right.
that are geographically really far apart, but they both show us that even democratic systems can be unstable.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's through legal challenges or impeachment processes, there's always the potential for things to change dramatically.
Right, and the outcomes of these cases are going to have a big impact on the political landscapes of both of these countries. Okay, so let's look at what's happening in Eastern Europe. There are some really different perspectives on the situation in Ukraine right now.
Yeah.
ABC News is reporting that Germany sees the efforts to reach a truce as basically deadlocked.
Mm-hmm.
But China is saying that they think the talks are actually encouraging.
Wow, so two very different interpretations.
Yeah, and this comes as ABC News is quoting Zelensky as saying that Putin couldn't care less about a ceasefire.
Hmm.
And apparently Zelensky said this after Trump issued a warning to Putin.
Oh, really?
And Zelensky also urged Trump to take action.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, ABC News also noted that Russia didn't launch any drones into Ukraine overnight.
Huh. So maybe a little bit of a break.
Yeah, maybe just a pause. But then a Kremlin official told ABC News that Russia sees the process of ending this war as something that's going to take a long time.
Okay.
And China has also repeated their optimistic view of the talks.
Yeah, so it sounds like we're kind of at a standstill right now with everyone interpreting things very differently.
It does, yeah. It feels like a stalemate.
Yeah, and these contrasting views really highlight how complicated the geopolitical situation is.
Right.
Germany's pessimism is probably based on what's actually happening,
Right. They're not seeing a lot of progress.
Exactly. And China might be being optimistic as part of their diplomatic strategy.
Right.
And it's understandable that Zelensky is frustrated because the aggression is still going on.
Of course.
So that lack of drone attacks could just be a tactical decision.
Right.
But what the Kremlin is saying suggests that this conflict isn't going to end anytime soon.
Right. Okay. So tensions are also really high in Asia right now.
Okay.
Al Jazeera. The Guardian and Sky News are all reporting that China has conducted military drills off the coast of Taiwan. And they've been using some pretty harsh language, too. They've even called Taiwan's president a parasite.
Wow, that's really aggressive.
Yeah, it is. And Taiwan has unsurprisingly strongly condemned these actions, according to Al Jazeera.
Right.
And NPR saying that China has been practicing attack and blockade maneuvers.
Okay, so this seems like a pretty significant escalation, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
These drills and that kind of rhetoric, they're a clear sign that China is trying to intimidate Taiwan
Right.
and assert their claims over the island.
Right.
So those practice attacks and blockades, they're sending a very direct message.
Yeah.
And it really makes you worry that there could be an actual conflict in the region.
Right.
But Taiwan's response shows that they're determined to remain autonomous.
Okay, let's shift over to the Middle East now.
All right.
The Guardian is reporting that Israel has issued an evacuation order for some parts of northern Gaza.
Oh, that's worrying.
Yeah, it's not a good sign. Al Jazeera is saying that Israel has bombed Beirut in Lebanon again.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is really putting that truce with Hezbollah to the test.
Yeah, that truce was already pretty fragile.
It was,
Yeah.
Al Jazeera is also reporting that Netanyahu has reversed his decision to nominate someone for spy chief.
Okay.
And apparently this happened after the U.S. criticized the nomination.
Huh.
Yeah. And Al Jazeera is also saying that the U.S. is continuing its air campaign against the Houthis in Yemen.
Okay.
And Trump has said that he believes that the group has been decimated.
Mm-hmm.
But then on the other hand, NPR is reporting that Iran has rejected direct negotiations with the U.S. after they got a letter from Trump.
Oh, so it sounds like there are multiple flashpoints happening at the same time in the Middle East right now.
It does, yeah.
Yeah. and things are still really volatile there.
Absolutely.
So that evacuation order in Gaza and those new bombings in Beirut, they're not good signs.
Right.
And the fact that the U.S. is putting pressure on Netanyahu about that spy chief nomination just shows how complicated that relationship is.
Yeah.
And then you have Iran refusing to talk to the U.S.,
Yeah.
which just shows how deep that mistrust runs and how difficult it's going to be to de-escalate the situation.
Absolutely, and especially with the conflict in Yemen still going on.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so finally, there's just a ton of other news stories that we wanted to mention. Everything from a heartbreaking search for a missing girl in the Thames,
Oh, no.
yeah, to some lighter news about who's going to star in a Beatles biopic.
Cool.
Yeah. There have been some tragic accidents and legal settlements and abuse cases, some archaeological discoveries, and even a story about the world's oldest cat and how it only drinks bottled water.
Really? Wow. That's a lot.
Yeah, it really is. I think it just kind of reminds us that even though we tend to focus on the big international news stories, there are just countless other things happening all over the world.
Right. And they're all affecting people's lives in really profound ways.
Exactly. You know, we've got personal tragedies, local community events, scientific discoveries, cultural milestones. It's just a huge and interconnected world.
It really is.
Yeah. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into just one day of global news, it's pretty obvious that we're living in a time of a lot of change and a lot of interconnectedness.
Definitely.
So what would you say is like the main takeaway from all of this?
I think the thing that really stands out to me is how closely connected economic problems, geopolitical tensions, and humanitarian crises all are. You know, whether it's the rising cost of living that's impacting individuals, or trade wars that are affecting global markets, or natural disasters that are made worse by political instability.
Right.
These things are rarely isolated, they often make each other worse, and they need to be tackled in a way that considers all of those different factors.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, so as you, the listener, reflect on all of these stories, what stands out to you the most, and what connections did you notice between these events that seem so different?
Yeah,
It definitely gives you a lot to think about.
it does.
So thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
All right.
Okay.
Bye.